At 4:47 on the morning of August 3, 1944, Corporal James Dalton lay prone in a muddy observation post 400 yards west of Carentan, peering through a contraption his fellow officers had mocked for 3 weeks. 24 years old, Detroit machinist, 0 enemy batteries located. The Germans had 4 80mm guns operating in the hedgerow country, and in the past 7 days they had destroyed 23 Sherman tanks and killed 41 American crewmen. Dalton's battalion commander had called his rangefinder a basement hobby. The forward observers called it Fisher-Price artillery equipment. When he had assembled the wooden device with its salvaged compass parts and camera lenses at his kitchen table in Michigan, his father wanted to know if this was meant for hunting or warfare. Dalton explained it was for mathematics. They shipped out before he could test it. Dalton spent the crossing to Normandy watching other men check their military-issue equipment, while his own instrument sat wrapped in canvas in his duffel. He carried it through the landing despite his sergeant's orders to leave the junk behind. 3 weeks later, in late July of 1944, a desperate battalion commander summoned him to the command post and pointed at a map. Behind those hedgerows were the guns killing his tankers every dawn. Could that homemade thing find them? The rangefinder weighed 14 pounds. The mirrors added another 8 ounces. The standard military rangefinder issued to trained forward observers weighed 12 pounds with triple the magnification and cost $3,000. Dalton's had cost him $47 in parts from a Detroit pawn shop. The fog was total. Somewhere in the gray, invisible, were the guns. Dalton had 15 minutes to prove his mathematics could do what doctrine could not. If you want to get more interesting WW2 stories, please like, share, and subscribe. The basement workshop on Cadillac Avenue smelled of machine oil and solder flux. James Dalton worked under a single bare bulb, his hands moving with the precision his father had taught him at the tool and die shop, where they both pulled night shifts. It was April 1944, and while other men his age were already overseas, Dalton had spent the past 6 months with a deferment that felt more like borrowed time. The lathe upstairs ran 16 hours a day making artillery shell casings. The government needed machinists as badly as it needed riflemen. But the draft notice had arrived that morning. On the workbench sat his latest project, 3 months in the making. A rangefinder constructed from parts he had salvaged, bargained for, and in some cases simply invented when no existing component would serve. The base was oak, cut and sanded until the grain ran true. The optical system came from a broken surveyor's transit he had found at a pawn shop on Woodward Avenue for $12. The mirrors were from a sextant that a merchant marine had sold him for a bottle of whiskey and $8 cash. The adjustment screws were from a disassembled compass, the calibration marks hand-engraved using his father's jeweler's files. The mathematics were sound. Triangulation, angle multiplication, geometric precision translated into mechanical advantage. In theory, the device could measure distances up to 4,000 yards by comparing angular measurements through 2 offset optical paths. In theory, it was as accurate as the military rangefinders the Army issued to artillery forward observers, the ones that cost more than Dalton made in 6 months. He had tested it exactly once, measuring the distance across the Detroit River to the Canadian shore. The calculation had been within 11 feet of the known distance. Close enough to matter. Dalton wrapped the rangefinder in canvas and oilcloth, then packed it carefully in the bottom of his duffel beneath 2 changes of clothes and his father's pocket watch. He reported to Fort Custer on April 19th with 37 other men from the Detroit Draft Board. The processing sergeant looked at his hands, saw the calluses and the grease that never quite washed out from under the nails, and marked him down for motor pool or ordnance. Somebody who knew tools. 3 days into basic training, Dalton made the mistake of showing the rangefinder to his platoon sergeant, thinking technical skill might be valued, might mean assignment to something other than rifle infantry. The sergeant held the wooden device, turned it over twice, and handed it back. "Leave the junk at home, Dalton. Army issues what you need." "Sergeant, it's a precision instrument. It could get you laughed out of a forward position is what. You want to carry something useful. Carry more ammunition." Dalton said nothing. That night, he repacked the rangefinder at the very bottom of his duffel and never mentioned it again. When they shipped out for advanced training at Camp Shelby in May, the instrument traveled with him, hidden beneath regulation gear and wrapped against the rain. The Army would tell him what he needed. But Dalton had learned from his father that the right tool, even a homemade one, could solve problems that brute force never would. The war would prove which philosophy was correct. They came ashore at Utah Beach on July 8th, 3 weeks after the initial invasion, and by July 10th, Dalton understood why men were calling Normandy a different kind of hell. The hedgerows were nothing like the training films had suggested. Ancient earthen walls topped with centuries of root growth, 10 feet high, and dense enough to stop a tank. The battalion advanced through a maze where visibility ended at 30 yards, and every field was a potential killing box. The German 88mm batteries had turned the pre-dawn hours into a slaughter. They fired from concealed positions somewhere in the hedgerow country south of Carentan, repositioning before American counter-battery fire could respond. The forward observers could hear the guns, could feel the shock of the impacts, could watch Shermans brew up in columns of black smoke, but they could not see the source. The hedgerows broke every sight line. The morning fog made it worse. On July 14th, Dalton watched 3 tanks burn before breakfast. The crews who made it out came back with burns that turned their skin into something that did not look like skin anymore. The battalion lost 4 more Shermans the next morning, 2 the morning after that. The forward observers were requesting air support, artillery sweeps across entire grid squares, anything to suppress the invisible guns. Nothing worked. The Germans fired, displaced, and vanished. Lieutenant Morrison gathered the platoon on the evening of July 16th and explained the situation in terms that required no interpretation. The battalion could not advance until the German batteries were neutralized. The forward observers, with their military-issue rangefinders, were moving closer to the suspected positions, trying to get line of sight. 2 had been killed by mortar fire that afternoon. The Germans knew exactly where to look for American spotters. Dalton made the suggestion that night, quietly, after the lieutenant had finished the briefing. He mentioned that he had built a rangefinder that might work at longer distances, might allow observation from positions the Germans were not targeting. Morrison looked at him the way a man looks at a puppy that has just offered to drive a truck. "You built a rangefinder?" "Yes, sir. It uses triangulation and—" "Dalton, we have forward observers with actual military equipment getting killed trying to locate those guns. You think your basement project is going to do better?" "Sir, it might allow for ranging from concealment. The optics are in your head, Corporal. Focus on your assigned duties. We need more foxholes dug on the perimeter, not science experiments." The lieutenant walked away. The other men in the platoon said nothing, but Dalton saw the looks. The machinist who thought he was smarter than the artillery officers, smarter than the trained observers with their $3,000 rangefinders and their forward observer school certifications. That night, Dalton lay in his foxhole and listened to the distant hammer of the 88mm guns starting their pre-dawn routine. Somewhere in the darkness, another Sherman was about to burn. He had the tool that might stop it, wrapped in canvas at the bottom of his duffel, and no one would let him try. The morning of August 2nd broke the battalion commander. 6 Shermans destroyed before 6 a.m., 17 men dead, and the German batteries still firing from positions no one could locate. Major Hendricks stood in the command post and looked at casualty reports that read like arithmetic problems with no solution. The forward observers had tried everything. Close reconnaissance had gotten men killed. Artillery sweeps across suspected grid squares had accomplished nothing except wasting shells the supply line could barely replace. Air support could not operate in the pre-dawn fog that the Germans used like a cloak. Hendricks was a regular army officer who had spent 20 years trusting the system, trusting doctrine, trusting that the equipment and training the army provided would be sufficient for the job. 3 weeks in the hedgerows had taught him that doctrine was written for a different kind of war. Lieutenant Morrison made the suggestion reluctantly, the way a man suggests something he does not believe will work but has run out of alternatives. One of his corporals claimed to have built a rangefinder. Homemade, probably useless, but the man was insistent, and maybe desperation earned him a hearing. "Send him up," Hendricks said. Dalton arrived at the command post at 0847 hours, carrying the rangefinder wrapped in canvas. He stood at attention while Hendricks finished reading a radio report about another failed observation mission. When the major finally looked up, his expression held no patience for incompetence and no hope for miracles. "Show me." Dalton unwrapped the device. In the harsh light of the command post, it looked exactly like what it was. A wooden box with brass fittings and salvaged optical components, assembled by someone with more ambition than budget. Hendricks picked it up, turned it over, examined the hand-engraved calibration marks. "You built this?" "Yes, sir. In Detroit, before deployment. It's a coincidence rangefinder using split image. Does it work?" "Sir, I tested it once across the Detroit River. The calculation was accurate to 11 feet at 2,100 yards. "That was a river. Have you tested it in combat conditions?" "No, sir." Hendricks set the rangefinder down and looked at Dalton with the expression of a man who has bet on worse odds and lost. The problem was that he had no better options left. The German batteries would kill more men at dawn tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, until someone found a solution or the battalion bled out trying. "Here's what's going to happen, Corporal. You're going to take that contraption to an observation post tonight. You're going to locate those batteries before dawn. If you succeed, I'll want to know how it works and whether we can build more. If you fail, you're going to pack that thing away and never mention it again. Clear?" "Yes, sir." "The forward observers will give you a position 400 yards ahead of our lines. You'll have a radio and a partner who knows how to call fire missions. The Germans start shooting at first light. That gives you until 0500 tomorrow to prove your mathematics work better than our doctrine." Hendricks dismissed him with a gesture. As Dalton turned to leave, the major added one final thought. "Corporal, 17 men died this morning because we can't find those guns. Don't waste this chance." The observation post was a shell crater half filled with rainwater and corpses that no one had retrieved. Dalton and his partner, Private First Class Warren, arrived at 0347 hours and settled into the mud on the crater's western lip. Warren was a forward observer's assistant who had survived 3 weeks by being careful and quiet. He carried the radio. Dalton carried the rangefinder and a field notebook, with pages already damp from the Norman humidity. The fog was absolute. At 50 yards, it became gray opacity. At 100 yards, it was a wall. Dalton could hear the German guns when they fired, but could see nothing. Visibility-based ranging was impossible. He would have to triangulate using sound, calculate distances using time intervals, and somehow confirm his mathematics with optical measurements through fog that defeated even military-grade optics. At 0421 hours, the first German gun fired. The sound came from roughly southeast, maybe 140 degrees on the compass. Dalton counted seconds until he heard the shell impact somewhere behind the American lines. 18 seconds. Artillery shells traveled at roughly 1,500 feet per second, depending on charge and elevation. He calculated backward, estimating trajectory, accounting for the time it took sound to reach his position. The second gun fired at 0428. Different sound signature, slightly different direction. Southeast by east, perhaps 155 degrees. Dalton marked the angle, timed the flight, and began sketching triangulation lines in his notebook. Two guns firing from slightly different positions gave him intersecting lines of bearing. Where they crossed was the probable location of the battery. Warren watched him work and said nothing. In the artillery, you learned to trust mathematics, or you learned to die badly. At 0439, the fog began to thin slightly as pre-dawn light filtered through. Dalton unfolded the rangefinder and aligned it toward the estimated position, southeast at approximately 3,100 yards based on his sound calculations. Through the split-image optics, he could barely make out the dark outline of a collapsed barn structure. He adjusted the mirrors, watching the two halves of the image slide across each other as the mechanical linkage translated angular measurements into distance. The calculation required 3 separate measurements to confirm. The rangefinder's coincidence mechanism multiplied small angular differences through mirror geometry, turning tiny adjustments into precise distance readings. Dalton took the first reading, 3,187 yards. He reset, measured again, 3,191 yards. The third reading, 3,185 yards. He averaged the 3 and checked his mathematics against the sound triangulation. The numbers matched within acceptable variance. Warren keyed the radio. Fire Direction Center, this is Oscar Papa 2. Fire mission. Grid coordinates. Dalton read off the numbers he had calculated, translating his rangefinder measurements into the grid system the artillery used. The voice on the radio repeated them back, skeptical but professional. The coordinates placed the German battery 600 yards closer than previous estimates had suggested. Hidden in terrain the battalion had already searched. Shot out, the radio said. They waited. At 0452 hours, Dalton heard the American counter-battery shells pass overhead. The distinctive whistle of 105mm howitzer rounds. He counted seconds, watching through the rangefinder. The first salvo impacted 200 yards long. He calculated the correction, radioed the adjustment. The second salvo would be for effect. The Fire Direction Center operator's voice carried doubt even through the radio static. Oscar Papa 2, confirm your coordinates. You're placing the target inside our previous search grid. Dalton looked at his notebook, where the mathematics were written in pencil that had smudged in the damp. Sound triangulation, optical ranging, geometric confirmation. 3 independent methods, all converging on the same solution. The German battery was 3,185 yards southeast, hidden in what remained of a stone barn that overlooked the American staging area. Closer than anyone had estimated, positioned where it could observe and adjust fire on every vehicle that moved through the morning assembly points. Coordinates confirmed, Dalton said. Target is a collapsed barn structure, stone foundation. Request fire for effect. Warren looked at him. In the gray pre-dawn light, the private's expression said what the radio operator was too disciplined to ask. Are you certain enough to bet lives on this? Dalton was certain of his mathematics. Whether mathematics was enough against the fog and chaos and the thousand variables that made warfare different from measuring distances across a peaceful river, that was the question the next 6 minutes would answer. The second salvo came at 4:54 hours. Dalton heard the shells before he saw them, the freight train sound of 100mm rounds in flight. He pressed the rangefinder against his eye socket and watched through the split-image optics as the rounds impacted. The first shell hit the stone foundation of the barn. The second struck 10 yards east. The third and fourth bracketed the target. Then the secondary explosions started. The German ammunition store detonated first, a sharp crack that echoed across the hedgerow country. Then the shells the 88mm guns had staged for their morning fire mission began cooking off in sequence, each explosion triggering the next. Through the rangefinder's optics, Dalton watched the barn structure collapse inward as the foundation gave way. "On target," he said into the radio. "Fire for effect. Repeat salvos." The third American volley arrived at 0456, the fourth at 0457. The Fire Direction Center was firing every gun in range now, saturating the coordinates Dalton had provided. The German battery position became a sustained eruption of smoke and debris, the kind of bombardment that left nothing functional and no one alive. At 04:58 hours, the fog began to lift. The dawn light turned the gray wall translucent, then transparent. Dalton lowered the rangefinder and looked at what his mathematics had found. The collapsed barn was exactly where he had calculated, 3,185 yards to the southeast. What remained of 4 German 88mm guns lay scattered in the rubble, barrels bent, carriages destroyed, ammunition still detonating in sporadic bursts. The position had a perfect line of sight to the American staging areas. From there, the Germans had been killing Shermans for 2 weeks, while remaining invisible to every observation method the Army had tried. Warren keyed the radio. "Fire Direction Center, Oscar Papa 2. Target destroyed. 4 guns confirmed. Mission complete." The radio crackled back. "Oscar Papa 2. Fire Direction Actual wants to know what kind of rangefinder you're using." Dalton wrapped the wooden device in its canvas covering and allowed himself the smallest expression of satisfaction. "Tell him it's homemade." The Germans learned quickly. By August 5th, they had deduced that American forward observation capability had improved dramatically, and they adjusted their tactics accordingly. Dalton was ranging a suspected mortar position from a hedgerow observation post when the first German counter-battery rounds began falling. 3-inch mortar shells, walking across the terrain in a methodical search pattern. The Germans were hunting the spotters. Warren pulled him back from the crater lip 15 seconds before a mortar round impacted exactly where they had been working. The explosion threw mud 40 feet into the air and left a crater where Dalton's rangefinder had been positioned. They crawled 200 yards east through the hedgerow before the follow-up bombardment began, systematic and professional. The Germans were targeting every location where an observer might have line of sight to their positions. Major Hendricks called Dalton to the command post that evening and explained the new problem with characteristic bluntness. The rangefinder had proven itself. Now it had made Dalton a target. The Germans knew someone was spotting with unusual accuracy, and they were dedicating resources to eliminating that capability. Forward observation posts were being bracketed within minutes of beginning ranging operations. 2 observers had been killed that afternoon. "You've become too valuable to lose and too dangerous to use conventionally," Hendricks said. "Find a way to work that doesn't get you killed." Dalton spent that night in his foxhole thinking about angles and deception. The problem was not the rangefinder's capability, but its visibility. Every time he used it from a forward position, he created a pattern the Germans could target. The solution required separating the observation from the calculation, disguising his true location while maintaining ranging accuracy. He began operating from multiple positions simultaneously. False observation posts with helmet-on-stick decoys and camouflage netting, designed to draw German fire. He would set up 3 or 4 dummy positions, then conduct actual ranging operations from a concealed location 500 yards away, using offset angles and indirect sighting methods. The Germans would bracket the decoys, while Dalton calculated coordinates from positions they did not know existed. The technique required more complex mathematics. Ranging from an offset position meant calculating corrections for the baseline displacement, compensating for the angle between his actual location and where the Germans assumed he was operating. The trigonometry became three-dimensional, accounting for elevation differences and the geometric relationship between false positions and his true firing solution. On August 8th, Dalton ranged a German battery from a position 1,200 yards laterally displaced from the observation post the enemy was targeting. He watched through the rangefinder as German mortars systematically destroyed a dummy position while he worked undisturbed, calculating coordinates from an angle the enemy had not anticipated. The American counter-battery fire destroyed 3 German guns while their mortar crews were still bracketing empty hedgerows. Warren, who had learned to trust Dalton's mathematics more than his own instincts, asked the obvious question. How long before they figure out we're not where they think we are? They already have, Dalton said, packing the rangefinder. That's why we're moving again. They'll adapt. We'll adapt faster. It's mathematics. But as they relocated for the 3rd time that day, Dalton understood that adaptation had limits. The Germans were learning his patterns as quickly as he could create them. Eventually, the geometry would favor the hunter instead of the hunted. The Office of Strategic Services captain arrived at the battalion command post on September 12th, wearing no unit insignia and carrying orders that Major Hendricks was not authorized to question. He wanted to speak with Corporal Dalton about technical matters. The conversation lasted 40 minutes and covered subjects that Hendricks was not invited to hear. Captain Ross explained the problem with characteristic OSS directness. The Germans were launching V-2 rockets from mobile sites in occupied territories, targeting London and Antwerp. The launch positions moved constantly, making them nearly impossible to locate through aerial reconnaissance. By the time bombers arrived, the launchers had relocated. Traditional artillery spotting was impossible because the sites were behind enemy lines, protected by security cordons that killed or captured conventional observers. The OSS needed someone who could teach resistance fighters to locate and range the launch sites using improvised equipment, then transmit coordinates for immediate airstrikes. Someone who understood optical instrumentation well enough to build rangefinders from salvaged materials. Someone who had proven he could make accurate calculations under combat conditions using homemade tools. Your rangefinder destroyed 4 German guns that professional observers couldn't find, Ross said. We need that capability behind enemy lines, where there's no supply chain and no military equipment. Can you build more? Dalton considered the question carefully. His own rangefinder had required specific components: quality optical glass, precision mirrors, mechanical calibration tools. Building crude versions from scrap metal and salvaged parts would mean reduced accuracy, simplified construction, and teaching people with no optical engineering background to make reliable measurements. I can design something simpler, he said. Basic triangulation using improvised sighting mechanisms. Not as accurate, but functional for ranging stationary targets at known elevations. How long to build a prototype? 48 hours if you can get me materials. Another week to document the construction process so someone else can replicate it. Ross handed him travel orders. Dalton was being temporarily assigned to OSS Special Operations for technical consultation. He would have access to a workshop in London with salvaged materials from bombed buildings. The mission timeline was immediate. The V-2 attacks were killing civilians faster than intelligence could locate the launch sites. By September 20th, Dalton had designed and built 3 simplified rangefinders using broken surveyor's equipment, pocket watch components, and optical lenses salvaged from damaged binoculars. The accuracy was reduced to within 50 yards at 2,000 yards, acceptable for directing airstrikes, but crude compared to his original instrument. More importantly, the design could be assembled by someone with basic mechanical aptitude, following written instructions and dimensional drawings. The OSS flew him to a resistance training facility outside Lyon in early October. He spent 2 weeks teaching French resistance fighters to build the instruments, calculate triangulation, and radio coordinates using encoded transmission protocols. The fighters were mechanics, farmers, school teachers, people who understood tools but not optical engineering. Dalton translated his basement expertise into procedures simple enough for someone working by candlelight in an occupied village to follow. On October 19th, a resistance cell near Lille used one of Dalton's improvised rangefinders to locate a V-2 launch site and transmit coordinates to Allied Bomber Command. The airstrike destroyed the launcher 18 minutes after the resistance fighters radioed the position. It was the first successful interdiction of a mobile V-2 site using ground-based ranging. Ross reviewed the mission report and looked at Dalton with the expression of someone who had found an unexpected solution to an impossible problem. How many more of these can you teach people to build? Dalton thought about basement workshops in Detroit, about salvaged parts and mathematical precision, about problems that expensive equipment could not solve, but improvisation might. As many as you need. The Ardennes forest in December 1944 was a different kind of war. The German counteroffensive had shattered American lines, and OSS technical reconnaissance teams were operating behind rapidly shifting front lines, locating enemy positions for artillery and airstrikes. Dalton worked with a 4-man team that moved through snow-covered terrain where supply lines did not reach, and equipment failure meant death. His rangefinder broke on December 19th when the team was ambushed crossing a frozen stream. A German round shattered the optical housing, destroying the mirror alignment that made the instrument functional. Dalton spent that night in a snow-covered foxhole, rebuilding the ranging capability using a broken pair of binoculars, a compass, and pure trigonometry. He measured angles using the binocular's remaining lens, calculated distances using the known separation between observation points, and confirmed his mathematics by timing artillery shell flights. The improvised method worked. The calculations were crude but adequate. More importantly, they required nothing except basic optical components and the ability to perform geometric calculations in a field notebook. Dalton began documenting everything, every field modification, every improvised technique, every lesson learned from operating where military supply chains could not reach. He wrote in pencil in waterproof notebooks, sketching dimensional diagrams and trigonometric formulas alongside practical construction notes. How to calibrate a rangefinder using known distances. How to estimate range using artillery impact timing. How to build sighting mechanisms from watch parts and measuring tape. The manual grew through the winter campaigns. By January 1945, it covered 17 different improvised ranging methods, each one tested under combat conditions and documented with the precision Dalton had learned in his father's machine shop. The techniques assumed nothing except basic materials and a willingness to trust mathematics over equipment. Artillery observers began requesting copies. Forward observer teams that had lost their military-issue rangefinders were using Dalton's methods to continue operations. Resistance fighters across occupied Europe were building instruments based on his designs. The OSS distributed translated versions to partisan groups in Italy, Greece, and Yugoslavia. Captain Ross reviewed the manual in February 1945 and recognized what it represented. This was not just technical documentation, but a fundamental shift in how the military approached field equipment. Dalton had proven that sophisticated capability did not require sophisticated tools. It required sophisticated thinking applied to whatever materials were available. "This needs to be formalized," Ross said. "Official doctrine, not just field notes." "It's a collection of workarounds," Dalton said. "Temporary solutions for when proper equipment isn't available." "Corporal, your temporary solutions have been adopted by half the artillery observers in Europe. That's not a workaround. That's doctrine." The Army began formalizing Dalton's techniques in March 1945. What had started as basement engineering and foxhole improvisation became Technical Manual 6-250, Field Expedient Ranging and Survey Methods. The manual was distributed to artillery schools, forward observer training programs, and reconnaissance units across all theaters. Dalton's section on improvised rangefinders became required reading at Fort Sill Artillery School. His trigonometric methods for estimating range without instruments became standard training for situations where equipment was damaged or unavailable. The underlying philosophy that engineering skill and mathematical precision could substitute for expensive equipment influenced military procurement and training doctrine for decades. In April 1945, Dalton received orders transferring him stateside for instructor duty. The war in Europe was ending, and the Army wanted him teaching the next generation of forward observers. His homemade rangefinder had evolved from a mocked contraption into the foundation of an entirely new approach to field artillery observation. The mathematics had been proven correct. The philosophy behind them, improvisation, adaptation, trusting calculations over equipment, had changed how the Army thought about technical problems in combat. Fort Sill Artillery School, Oklahoma, Spring 1947. The rangefinder sat in a glass display case in the Forward Observer Training Building, illuminated by overhead lights that made the brass fittings gleam against the worn oak base. A small placard identified it as the instrument Corporal James Dalton had built in a Detroit basement and used to locate German batteries at Carentan in August 1944. Next to it lay a worn copy of Technical Manual 6-250, open to page 17, where Dalton's hand-drawn diagrams illustrated improvised triangulation methods. Dalton stood in front of the display case wearing sergeant's stripes and instructor tabs, addressing 43 forward observer candidates who had arrived at Fort Sill expecting to learn about military-issue rangefinders and standard fire direction procedures. Instead, their first lesson covered what to do when equipment failed. Supply lines collapsed, or the mission required capabilities that no issued instrument provided. The rangefinder in that case cost $47 in parts, Dalton said. Military-issue coincidence rangefinders cost $3,000 and weigh 12 pounds. Mine weighs 14 pounds and uses mirrors from a pawn shop sextant. The question is not which instrument is better. The question is which instrument you have when you need to call fire missions. He walked to the chalkboard and began sketching geometric diagrams, triangulation using 2 observation points, range estimation using artillery impact timing, angular measurement using improvised sighting mechanisms. The candidates copied the formulas into notebooks, learning mathematics that their instructors insisted were more important than any piece of equipment the Army would issue them. In December 1944, my rangefinder was destroyed in an ambush, Dalton continued. I was behind German lines with a reconnaissance team that needed coordinates for an airstrike. I had a broken pair of binoculars, a compass, and a field notebook. The mathematics worked the same way they had worked in Detroit, in Normandy, and in every observation post I had operated from. I calculated the range using triangulation and timed shell flights. The airstrike destroyed the target because the mathematics were correct, not because I had the right equipment. The lesson that day covered 17 improvised ranging methods, each one documented in Technical Manual 6250, each one proven under combat conditions. The candidates learned to build sighting mechanisms from watch parts, to estimate range using sound triangulation, to calculate firing solutions using nothing except trigonometry and careful observation. By 1947, Dalton's techniques had been adopted across the artillery branch. Forward observers deployed with knowledge of improvised methods alongside their issued equipment. Reconnaissance teams carried copies of Technical Manual 6-250 as essential field gear. The philosophy had spread beyond artillery into other branches where technical problems required adaptive solutions rather than standardized equipment. Dalton finished the lesson and dismissed the candidates. As they filed out, several stopped to examine the rangefinder in the display case, studying the hand-engraved calibration marks and the salvaged components that had proven more effective than equipment that cost 60 times as much. One candidate asked the question Dalton heard most often. "Sergeant, do you wish you had built it better, used higher quality parts?" Dalton looked at the rangefinder, remembering the basement workshop on Cadillac Avenue, the skeptical sergeants, the fog-covered hedgerows where mathematics had proven stronger than mockery. "It was built exactly right," he said. "It proved that you don't need perfect equipment to solve problems. You need perfect mathematics and the willingness to trust them when everyone else tells you you're wrong." The rangefinder remained in the display case alongside the manual that had become required reading for every artillery observer the Army trained. The lesson survived beyond equipment, beyond doctrine, beyond the war that had proven its worth. Sometimes the best military technology was the one a soldier could build from parts in a foxhole. The rest was just mathematics.